Okay, let's get started. Today we start the fourth of the four branches of macroeconomics, that of understanding the government's long-term budget. And as I say, macroeconomics is always somewhat of a grab bag. That is, there's a clear relationship between depression and inflation economics. That the one is when aggregate demand is too low, the other is when aggregate demand is in a sense too high. You can argue that growth economics certainly belongs with the other two because it also deals with the aggregate economy and with issues that are simply not considered in microeconomics. The government budget part of macroeconomics may fit least easily with the other three because it's a whole set of issues, many of which are microeconomic, in the sense that they're the normal economics of marginal costs and marginal benefits, of marginal thises, of marginal that's, of supply and demand, and externalities, as opposed to the macro issues we've been dealing with all semester. Nevertheless, we don't do this in IAS 106. We don't do very much of it in IAS 106. So I think it's worth doing it here. And so we're going to do it. And I think it's going to consume most of the rest of what's now an appallingly little 3 weeks of classes, because there is actually a lot to cover. First, logistics. The bureaucracy at Berkeley continues to grow. Or perhaps I should say that the bureaucracy at Berkeley has woken up now that California Hall has realized that Governor Brown's belief that he could strike a budget deal with Republican members of the legislature for the state is not going to come true. And hence Berkeley's funding, among other things, is going to be on the potential chopping block for the next California fiscal year. And we don't have the large endowment cushion of the private universities to sit and dither and think about how we're going to cut costs. Those considerations tend to make me think that I'm going to have to push my office hours for this week off to Thursday after class. So that's when office hours are going to be this week. For lecture readings, the best things to read for lectures this week is chapters 6 and 7 of Marty Olney's and my textbook, along with the assigned section reading, the Congressional and Budget Office Long-Term Budget Outlook. Readings for next week are chapters 14 and 15 of the DeLong and Olney textbook. And April 14th. Right? April 14th, we'll put out the take-home assignment over the internet, and it'll be due April 19th at the start of the class. I'm thinking in the interest of saving trees of making it an internet-due assignment. I'm asking you to email me a PDF file of what you've produced, simply for ease in taking all of the things around on trips and elsewhere, rather than carting around a file of 150-odd different little papers on macroeconomics. Then after that, Monday the 19th, problem set 9. I think problem set 9. That's alarming. I think we'll make problem set 9 go out on Monday, April 19th, which will then make it due Tuesday, April 19th, which will then make it due Thursday, April 28th, which then means we won't have space for a problem set 10. So everyone will get a 4 on problem set 10. And we'll cut the assignments for the course back by 1. Is the way logistics of this thing are going to work. Now, thinking about what's going to be on the final, it seems to me that as on the first midterm, a good half of the final ought to be problems. A good quarter ought to be concepts, or maybe a little less than a quarter, and a good quarter, or perhaps a little more than a quarter, maybe a third, ought to be short answers and maybe an essay or two. And thinking about the problems that I'd ask you to be familiar with, looking back over the learning goals for this course, we've come up with 22 kinds of different problems. 3 sets of problems from economic growth: your ability to use the production function equation, your ability to calculate a balanced growth path, your ability to use the balanced growth path equation for GDP per worker to do some forecasting of where economies are going to be in the future. 4 types of problems for depression economics: those of manipulating the national income and product accounts definitions, our income expenditure model, our investment savings version of the income expenditure model, and then thinking about how movements in real interest rates affect the level of production. We also have 4 kinds of questions for inflation economics: using the quantity theory of money, using the Phillips curve, combining the Phillips curve with how central banks react, this idea of a central bank having an inflation target and trying to reach it in the monetary policy reaction function. And then last, our requirement that the system be expectationally consistent. Where is it going to go in the long run when people's expectations become rational, if they ever do, and in which the Federal Reserve manages to hit its inflation target, or come close to hitting its inflation target, and people's expectations of inflation come true? To that, in the next 3 weeks, we're going to be adding an extra 3 kinds of problems to solve. Those involving calculating the sustainability of a government's budget plans. Those concerning the burden of running up a government debt on an economy. And those concerning crowding out, the circumstances under which increasing government spending is expensive. Increasing government spending is expensive because it reduces investment, so reduces the rate of long-term economic growth. In addition to those 14 types of problems, and figure out there are 8 pieces of data that I think are important enough that I'm going to be free to ask about them on the exam, and may ask about all 8. The stuff we've done about the pace of long-term growth, the level of world GDP, and the spread of world GDP. The stuff we've done on what the unemployment rate is, what the employment to population ratio is, and what the inflation rate is. And what we'll do in the next 3 weeks, trying to get into your heads some numbers about what government spending are, what taxes are, and what government deficits are. So as you people look forward to studying for the final, right, these 22 areas are together going to make up at least half the exam. And with that, let me move into the crowding out lecture. The lecture on the circumstances in which you want to cut government spending for 2 reasons. First, because you think if you cut government spending, you'll get higher private investment and faster economic growth over the long term. And second, because you think if you cut government spending, you'll get a boost to investment and higher production, higher incomes, higher spending in the short term. And that's interesting because it's an argument that's fairly powerful these days. We've seen it in Western Europe for the past 2 years at least. We've seen it in Great Britain for the past year. We've seen it in Japan for the past 10 years or so. And we're starting to see it in the United States, with Barack Obama last Thursday night praising the House-Senate administration budget deal, which cuts $38 billion off of government spending over the next 6 months, which makes all of us kind of Keynesian economists go, you're cutting government spending by $38 billion over the next 6 months. Interest rates on Treasury securities can't drop any lower. It's not that you're doing this to reduce interest rates and so boost private investment. What's going to make up for this cut in government purchases? Is there going to be anything to make it up at all? Doesn't look like it. Well, you've just taken your next 6 months of employment growth and you've thrown 2 months of it away. Why is this a thing to praise? I understand why it may be a politically necessary thing, but it doesn't seem to me to be a thing to praise. But let's lay out the argument in which you do want to cut government purchases in the short run, and you do because you think it'll produce a higher level of production, employment, and investment now, or at least not produce a lower level. So start with the assumption that the Federal Reserve has an unemployment rate target chosen to set inflation where the Federal Reserve wants it. Right? That as in the inflation economics section, the Federal Reserve has strong views about what the target rate of inflation ought to be, and is pushing the unemployment rate to whatever level it thinks will generate that level of inflation that the Federal Reserve wants to see. And add the assumption that the Federal Reserve actually manages to hit the unemployment rate target that it's aiming for, that it has the power and the ability to actually do this, and it does so successfully. And that tells us that given what the current price level is in the economy, the Federal Reserve sets the money stock to get the level of real GDP and thus of unemployment to where it wants. And if, in this quantity theory of money equation, where output is equal to the velocity of money times the real money stock, the level of the money stock divided by the price level, if velocity varies for any reason, the Federal Reserve moves the money stock to offset those movements in velocity, because it's interested in hitting its inflation target, which requires that it hit its unemployment target, which requires that it manipulate the level of real GDP to get that level of ease or tightness of the labor market that it wants to see given the Phillips curve. And the Federal Reserve will respond to any other changes in policy by taking these offsetting steps. Combine these assumptions with our IS, right, LM, with our investment savings model, that we have that output is equal to the real money stock, which the Federal Reserve controls, times the velocity of money, and the Federal Reserve is going to offset movements in the velocity of money. That's one equation, our liquidity money equation. That's one way of looking at the macroeconomy. The other way of looking at the macroeconomy is the investment savings equation, that we have our multiplier terms in the denominator, we have our baseline autonomous spending here, we have our government purchases, and we have our effective long-term real interest rates on aggregate demand, on investment spending, and on exports there. Now, both of these things are true. Right? The level of real GDP that comes out of our quantity theory of money equation here, that has to be the same thing as the level of real GDP that comes out of our investment savings equation here. And we can use that fact, by simply taking what the Federal Reserve policy is doing to shape the level of output and dropping it in on the left-hand side of our investment savings equation, simply replacing this Y with what Federal Reserve policy says Y has to be. And then we say, what's going to happen to this when the government changes its level of government purchases? And let's be things simple. Let's not think about changes in tax rates. Let's just say the government is going to hold tax rates constant, and all the fiscal policy that the government is going to do by changing its level of spending. You can add changes to taxes to this. It doesn't much affect the essentials. It does produce more complicated equations. But we're not going to. We're going to keep things simple. And just say that the government changes, that the government is going to change its spending by an amount delta G. What else is going to happen? Well, if the change in government spending is very small, people aren't going to notice. There isn't going to be any big effect on consumer or investor confidence or anything as long as the change in government purchases is small. Big changes, huge changes might have big effects. Small changes won't. So to a first approximation, this delta A0 term isn't going to change. What else might change? Well, there's really only one other thing in this equation that's a variable. The rest are parameters. The rest are behavioral responses, besides the confidence and foreign terms that are here. And that's the long-term real risky interest rate R here. The long-term real risky interest rate R can change. So when government purchases change, the long-term real risky rate interest rate R can change, and also real GDP can change. But we've already said that the Federal Reserve is no longer trying to manage the real interest rate. Instead, the Federal Reserve has this target for the level of output, and it changes its policy in order to hit that target. And it offsets movements in velocity and effects of other policies. So we know the Federal Reserve policy is focused on making this change in the left-hand side 0. And so then we have our equation with a 0 on the left-hand side, with a change in government purchases on the right-hand side, and with a bunch of other stuff, including a change in the long-term real risky interest rate R on the right-hand side. And as long as the Federal Reserve is actively trying to and is hitting its unemployment rate target in order to put inflation where it wants it, the numerator of this equation here, the numerator of this last equation down here, is going to be 0. So what then does fiscal policy have an effect on? We've just demonstrated that as long as the Federal Reserve is actively in the game and is able to push the economy wherever it wants, fiscal policy isn't going to have any effect on the level of production or of employment. What is it going to have an effect on then? Well, we can take this equation we had, which told us that fiscal policy, together with the other changes in the economy, had no effect on the level of output, and we can say, well, what must be happening for that to be true? What must be happening for the Federal Reserve to be able to neutralize the effects of fiscal policy on output and want to? And we can solve that by simply putting the delta R terms on the left-hand side and dividing to say, if fiscal policy has no effect on output, if boosting the government budget deficit, boosting government spending doesn't raise employment, then something must be happening to real interest rates when government purchases go up. Real interest rates must be rising, and real interest rates must be rising by this amount. And what happens if real interest rates rise by this amount? Well, we have equations for the effect of changes in real interest rates on investment spending and on exports. We see that the change in investment spending is minus the sensitivity of investment to the real interest rate times the change in the real interest rate. Similarly for exports, we know what the change in the real interest rate is going to be in this situation. It's this thing here. Simply substitute this expression for the change in government purchases for this one for the change in the real interest rate. And we get that this term here will be what happens to investment spending when government purchases go up. It goes down. What happens here when government purchases go up to exports? Right? Exports go down. And then you see it really is then the case that when government purchases go up, the sum of investment spending and exports go down, and goes down by exactly the same amount that government purchases go up. So this is the basic argument by which expansionary fiscal policy is supposed to be ineffective at boosting output. What does it do instead? Well, it boosts real interest rates, and it reduces investment spending and exports. Have a higher level of government purchases, you have a lower level of private investment, and because investment is lower, your rate of long-term economic growth slows. This argument was first made, I think, in this form in 1962 by MIT economist Robert Solow while he was working for the United States government's Council of Economic Advisors. And this was his argument for why you ideally would want to have a budget surplus. To whatever your taxes were, your government purchases should be lower because you didn't want to have excess government spending crowding out investment. Instead, you wanted faster, long-run economic growth. Right? You wanted to crowd in investment. How can we tell whether this is going on at any one particular time? Well, the argument that expansionary fiscal policy is ineffective at boosting production now, yeah. No, not all, right? They also, if the government changes its spending programs to give a, say, tax break if you buy medical insurance, that's going to boost consumption spending. If you do change tax rates, that's going to have a lot of effects on lots of different microeconomic pieces. This is just if you're sitting at a very macroeconomic level and just considering an abstract and undifferentiated change in spending. The other stuff we might get to later on, but it's too micro for this lecture. Okay? So if you want to argue that expansionary fiscal policy is ineffective, it requires that increases in government purchases come along with large enough increases in real interest rates to crowd out their effects on output. That decreases in government purchases come accompanied by decreases in real interest rates to crowd in higher investment and exports. And if you don't see the response to changes in government purchases happening in the path of real interest rates, the argument fails. What are the consequences of the argument failing? Well, for one thing, it tells you that your assumption that the Federal Reserve is able to hit its real GDP and unemployment target through monetary policy is probably wrong. And that, indeed, the Federal Reserve is probably out of ammunition in one form or another and unable to fully control the state of the economy, which seems to be true now. And we can tell whether this is going on now. And the answer appears to be broadly no. That the shift to more expansionary fiscal policy in the United States in early 2009, if you can see an increase in real interest rates as the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act is proposed, enacted, and implemented, I certainly cannot. I see some fluctuations in the long-term real interest rates on government securities that are matched by fluctuations in private securities. But they seem to me to match more general beliefs about optimism and pessimism, rather than interest rates going up when big fiscal plans are proposed and enacted, which would have been here, and interest rates going down, say here at the start of 2010 when Obama pivots to arguing for arguing for priority to deficit reduction. And interest rates certainly don't fall in late 2010 as the Republican Congressional Party runs and wins election on a platform of we're going to cut the deficit, we're going to cut government spending if we manage to get into office. And we'll see exactly what happens to interest rates as these plans are implemented. But so far as Republican congressional power has been translated into Republican victories, I don't see any big reduction. I don't see any big reduction in long-term real interest rates. Especially because we did see such big reductions in the early and mid-1990s. This is back before we had Treasury inflation-protected securities. So we don't have a nice time series of the real interest rate, of the interest rate adjusted for inflation, because the Treasury doesn't issue bonds that promise to pay inflation plus whatever its coupon is. Instead, we just have the standard 30-year Treasury nominal bond. But back in the years of the first President Bush, the President Bush who'd started out in 1980 by calling Ronald Reagan's economic program one of voodoo economics, and then becoming the biggest of true believers in Reaganism, so much so that his applause line at the 1988 Republican presidential campaign was that Congress is going to say our deficit's too big, and Congress is going to say that the government deficit can't be closed by spending cuts alone, and Congress is going to send me tax bills, and I'm going to tell them, read my lips, no new taxes. Those were the days of 1989 and 1990. And back then, the long-term 30-year Treasury interest rate was up at 8.5% to 9% per year, which is a rather high interest rate in an economy where you think the long-term rate of inflation is going to be something like 2 or 3%. Then, in late 1990, George H.W. Bush changes his mind, or perhaps his advisors Michael Boskin and Richard Darman convince him to return to his old normal mind, the normal mind of a standard Republican who thinks that budget balance is more important than low taxes no matter what, and who believes in Milton Friedman's saying that if you're going to spend, you have to tax. Then in the long run, if you're going to spend, you have to tax. In the short and medium term, you can borrow, but then you have to tax to pay off your borrowing. And if you spend and don't tax, then you eventually pay off your borrowing by printing money, and you're in Zimbabwe land, you're in hyperinflation land, you really don't want to be there. And so in late 1990, George H.W. Bush strikes a deal with the Democrats and the moderate Republicans in Congress to raise taxes and reduce the growth rate of entitlement spending. And the right wing of the Republican Party howls. And in fact, George H.W. Bush gets a primary challenge in 1992 from Pat Buchanan, who says this isn't a Republican, we don't want to reelect him, for being too interested in cutting the deficit no matter what. And then gets a third-party challenge from H. Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire, who says George H.W. Bush isn't interested enough in cutting the deficit. And when everything clears, Bill Clinton has been elected president with 38% or with 43% of the vote in late 1992. But over the course of 1991, as it becomes clear that George H.W. Bush actually means what he said about balancing the budget being top priority, even if it means raising taxes, and then throughout 1992, as once Ross Perot enters the election, let's make sure this is on. This is on. Once Ross Perot enters the campaign, all of a sudden all the presidential candidates begin competing with each other to offer deficit reduction plans. And even more so in 1993, as it becomes clear that raising taxes and lowering the growth rates of federal spending are going to be Bill Clinton's only legislative accomplishment in 1993. Treasury interest rates fall and fall substantially. Then comes 1994, and the dot-com boom hits. And as the dot-com boom hits, America's private companies begin borrowing at a furious rate